Imagine a drone cutting through the dark. No lights, no noise. Just a camera, a payload, and a target somewhere ahead. That drone is actively feeding live imagery back to commanders miles away. It's finding its target in real time right now. So ask yourself, what is the single most important thing keeping that drone on mission at this exact moment? Think about it. The bomb, the camera, the navigation system? According to Reuters reporting from May 2026, it might actually be the internet bill. Here's what Reuters reported. When U.S. Lucas suicide drones began making gains against Iran in early 2026, something unexpected happened behind closed doors. SpaceX executives, Elon Musk's company, met with Pentagon officials and delivered a message. The military had been underpaying for satellite connections. The Pentagon was paying around $5,000 per drone connection. SpaceX argued those drones were using a $25,000 tier of service. That's a five-fold price increase. On a drone costing roughly $30,000, this proposed change nearly doubled the total unit cost overnight. And the Pentagon ultimately agreed to pay the higher price. Because right now, there's simply no comparable alternative to Starlink for battlefield connectivity. Now, Elon Musk called Reuters' story false. A Pentagon spokesperson said it was wrong. There's genuine dispute about the specifics here, but here's why the dispute itself is so revealing. Both sides acknowledge the core reality. The U.S. military depends on a private satellite network to fight. SpaceX's Starlink constellation has roughly 10,000 satellites in orbit. That's over 60% of all tracked objects currently circling the Earth. When that network becomes the eyes, ears, and nervous system of your military, the company running it gains extraordinary leverage over you. Forget the specific dollar amounts for a moment. The deeper question this story forces us to ask is something far more fundamental about power. When a modern army needs a private company's network just to fight, who actually owns the war? That's what this whole video is about. Now your first instinct might be, this sounds new. A tech billionaire influencing military operations? That's a 21st century problem, right? Here's the thing. Private companies have been embedded inside military power for literally centuries. The form has changed dramatically. The pattern has not. Think about what a military actually needs. Soldiers, yes. But also ships, food, transportation networks, medical supplies, and communications infrastructure to function. No government in history has ever had enough of all of that on its own. Private hands have always filled the gaps. Always. What I want you to notice is how the nature of what's being outsourced has shifted. Across centuries, from simple physical assets to existential infrastructure, in earlier centuries, nations outsourced the physical stuff. Ships, boots, and bullets, the weapons and the bodies carrying them into combat. Today, nations are outsourcing something far more fundamental. The connectivity layer, the command infrastructure, the digital backbone that makes precision warfare possible. Let me take you through 3 historical moments that show exactly how this escalation happened and what it means for the present. 1600, London. A group of merchants pools capital and convinces the English crown to grant them something extraordinary. A royal charter. The East India Company. Their stated mission, trade. Spices, textiles, and goods that made enormous fortunes. A classic private enterprise story. At first, but the crown gave this company something no regular business gets. The legal right to make war, sign treaties, and govern foreign territory. Think about that for a second. A corporation, on it with shareholders and profit motives, had legal authority to declare and conduct actual warfare, and they didn't hesitate. The East India Company built its own army. At its peak, it commanded more soldiers than many sovereign nations today. By 1856, the company, not the British government, controlled nearly the entire Indian subcontinent. It taxed populations, it administered cities, it made law. The line between corporation and government had completely dissolved. This wasn't a contractor supporting a state. This was a contractor that had replaced the state. Then it collapsed. In 1857, Indian soldiers in the company's army rose up in a massive revolt. The company lost control, like completely and catastrophically, and who stepped in? The British Crown. Parliament passed the Government of India Act of 1858 and stripped the company of every power it held. The company's armies, territories, and administration were transferred to the Crown. The private experiment failed, and the public absorbed every consequence. The critical lesson here: the company wasn't malicious. It was doing exactly what companies do, pursuing profit and expanding operations wherever possible. But when private power operates without democratic accountability in something as high stakes as war, the public eventually pays for the failures. Every time, keep that pattern in mind, because 300 years later, in a very different setting, we're going to see that exact dynamic repeat itself. Jump forward. American Civil War, 1864. General Ulysses S. Grant is trying to take Petersburg, Virginia, a key step toward ending the war. He has over 100,000 troops and 65,000 horses, and he needs to continuously feed, arm, and move all of them. The solution was a military railroad, over 21 miles of track, 25 locomotives, hundreds of rail cars built under civilian contract, food, weapons, ammunition, wounded soldiers heading back. All of it moved by rail. Private infrastructure was the literal backbone of that entire campaign. Fast forward to 1917. America enters World War I, and suddenly the private railroad system spanning the entire continent begins to buckle under pressure. The railroads were all privately owned. When war demand exploded, the network couldn't cope. Trains backed up. Cargo sat stranded on platforms for days. Troops couldn't move. Equipment couldn't ship. One of the great engineering achievements of the industrial era was functionally gridlocked across the country. So President Wilson did something dramatic. In December 1917, he nationalized the railroads. The U.S. Railroad Administration took direct federal control of the entire network. For about 3 years, the federal government ran privately owned trains. When peace came in 1920, they handed the railroads back to their original owners. Here's the pattern I want you to notice. Private network works fine in peacetime. Crisis hits, network fails, state seizes control. Every time, but here's what makes today categorically different. In 1917, seizing a railroad meant sending federal marshals to a train station. Physically possible. How do you seize a satellite constellation? How do you nationalize 10,000 objects moving at 17,000 miles per hour in low Earth orbit? Okay, maybe you're thinking, fine, that's history. Surely the modern U.S. military has learned to be self-sufficient by now. Let me show you something. There's a program called the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, CRAF. Most Americans have never heard of it, but it has moved actual armies around the world. Here's how CRAF works. Delta, United, FedEx, American Airlines. These carriers sign peacetime contracts with the Department of Defense. Voluntary, but incentivized. Those contracts say, if we activate you, you provide your planes and crews for military airlift. In exchange, you get steady peacetime government business. This system was activated for real during Operation Desert Shield in 1990. And here's the statistic that should make you pause for a moment. Over 60% of the troops deployed to the Persian Gulf flew on commercial airliners. Not military planes. Delta, United, Northwest, civilian jets. Think about it. American soldiers deploying to a potential ground war. Flying commercial, deplaning in Saudi Arabia from a Delta 747. That actually happened. At sea, it's the same story. The Maritime Administration's Ready Reserve Force provides nearly 50% of government surge sea lift capability, managed by private contractors. Even the world's most powerful military, aircraft carriers, stealth bombers and all, cannot rapidly deploy itself without commercial aviation and commercial shipping. That's not a flaw. It's efficient by design. It makes economic sense in peacetime, but it creates structural dependence that doesn't vanish during conflict. And when that dependence is on one dominant company, not a distributed industry, the strategic risk profile changes significantly. That's exactly where we are now. Let's talk Iraq and Afghanistan, because this is where the outsourcing story gets complicated in ways that should genuinely concern all of us. Post 9/11, the U.S. deployed to 2 theaters simultaneously. And alongside the soldiers went a massive private logistics machine. By design, by doctrine, under a program called LOGCAP, private companies took over the daily operation of U.S. military bases overseas. Food, fuel, power, laundry, trash collection. The primary contractor for years was KBR, formerly part of Halliburton. Their LOGCAP 3 contract eventually reached a total value exceeding $35 billion. Let me repeat that so it lands. $35 billion to one company to handle the basic life support of the American military and theater. Now, that's not inherently wrong. Soldiers need to focus on fighting. Someone has to handle the food and the fuel. The question is always, with what oversight? The answer in Iraq and Afghanistan? Not enough oversight. The Commission on Wartime Contracting found at least $31 billion was lost to waste and fraud. That's a conservative estimate. The high-end figure approaches $60 billion in loss to fraud, abuse, and sheer mismanagement of public funds over a decade. In one documented case, a cash payment of $320 million was made to contractors with no supporting documentation beyond a single signature. How did this happen? Because when you outsource everything, you also outsource your ability to audit it. The DoD acquisition workforce was cut nearly in half. And here's the structural trap. Once your army depends entirely on one private contractor for power and food, walking away becomes nearly impossible. So bring all of that back to Starlink. Because everything we've just traced, the leverage, the dependency, the accountability gap, it's all there. The Pentagon is currently weighing a purchase of over 3,500 Starshield terminal subscriptions, a deal potentially worth hundreds of millions annually to SpaceX. Reuters reported that Britain's military began transitioning operational military traffic to Starshield in early 2026. This isn't just an American dependency anymore. The network that guides American and allied military operations is increasingly owned and operated by a single private company, led by a single individual. And that individual has already demonstrated willingness to make battlefield-level decisions based on personal judgment. Remember the Sevastopol incident back in 2023? Ukraine asked Musk to activate Starlink near Crimea to enable a naval strike on Russia's Black Sea fleet. He refused, fearing major conflict escalation. A private citizen, unelected, unconfirmed by any Senate, outside any military chain of command, made a call that shaped what happened on the battlefield. You might think he made the right call. You might even think a CEO should have that power, but here's why that's beside the point. The point is that the decision was his to make. Not a general's, not an elected official's. A private CEO decided where the war's boundaries were. The Pentagon says it's looking for alternatives. But as of today, no alternatives exist at comparable scale, coverage, or latency for battlefield applications. SpaceX gets roughly 20% of its revenue from government contracts. The Pentagon needs SpaceX far more than SpaceX needs the Pentagon. That's the leverage gap. With SpaceX pursuing an IPO at over $1 trillion in valuation, the company's commercial incentives are growing. They don't need to compromise with the Pentagon. So let's zoom all the way out. What does this whole story tell us? Not just about Starlink, but about the nature of modern warfare itself. War has always outsourced its physical needs, ships, soldiers, supply chains. But today, we've reached a new tier. We've outsourced the decision-making infrastructure. The East India Company ruled an empire. The railroads got nationalized. The Iraq contractors got investigated. Each time, private power eventually hit a wall. The question isn't whether governments will eventually reassert control over critical war infrastructure. History says they will. One way or another, probably badly. The real question is, what happens in the gap? What happens during the wars that are fought before that reassertion comes? That's the part that costs lives. Somewhere tonight, a drone is flying toward a target. It's guided by satellites. Those satellites are owned by a private company billing the Pentagon. Who owns the war? That question doesn't have a clean answer yet. But the fact that we're even asking it, that should tell you something important. That's a wrap for today. And honestly, this one's going to stay with you for a while. See you next time.